Good morning, church. Good morning. I love hearing that. It's good to be with you. Today we're going to pick up a little after where we left off last week. Last week, you'll remember, we looked at the story of how Rahab protected a few spies and how that was instrumental in Israel, the people of Israel, being able to take over the promised land. By the time we get to the beginning of the book of Samuel, of 1 Samuel, they have fully taken over the land and they're living there more or less in peace. They're living in small groups, but they start to get a little anxious with their living situation. They're getting anxious because what they really want is what they see when they look at the nations around them. When they look at the nations around them, they see that those nations are ruled by kings. And they say to God, "Hey God, we'd really like a king of our own. We'd like to be ruled by a king." And God speaks back to the people through the prophet Samuel and says, "You really don't. You don't want to be ruled by a king, because if a king rules over you and that king has good moral character, things will go all right. But if that king doesn't have strong moral character, they're going to lead you as a nation down dark paths. And things are going to go badly, not just for that king, but for everyone." And the people of Israel, having heard this great wisdom from God, said, "Yeah, but we want a king." And so God relents, and Samuel anoints a man named Saul to be the first king of Israel. And Saul starts out reasonably good. He's a decent king. He seeks after God's heart. He lives according to God's guidance and according to God's precepts. But this thing happens that seems to happen to every person who has absolute authority. Deception starts to creep in. Self-dealing and corruption start to seep in. And Saul goes from being a king who seeks after God's heart to a guy that's really just in it for himself. And the very thing that God warned about starts to happen. The military campaigns that he leads don't start to go so well. Things start to go badly for the whole nation. And around that time, a guy named David starts to rise in influence and prestige. You might remember David from being the boy with the 5 smooth stones and knocking down Goliath. Same guy, except now he's kind of like a military general. And he is having all sorts of military success in the very same places where Saul had seen only failures. And rather than Saul going, "Hey, David, good job," he gets jealous. He gets angry. He doesn't want to share the spotlight with anybody else. And so he actually starts to hunt David down. David and all of his men become, well, they're hunted. They're fugitives. And up to this point, there have been a couple close calls where Saul almost got David. There have been a couple chances where David had a chance to kill Saul, but passes on it because he knows it's not right. And by the time we get to today's reading, when David goes to one of the priests who serves in the temple and asks for food to feed his starving men, the priest greets him trembling. He's trembling because the priest, Ahimelech, knows what it is to defy the king and how that usually goes for people who defy the king. But to make matters even more complicated, David comes and asks for bread, but there is no ordinary bread around. There's no bread that he would be allowed to have. All that they have, all that Ahimelech has, is what's called the bread of the presence. You see, at this point, the people of Israel, as a way of reminding themselves that God is faithful and that God provides for people who are in need, just like God provided for them while they were in need in the wilderness. They took and set up a golden table just outside the Holy of Holies in the temple. And there on that table was always set 2 stacks of 6 loaves of unleavened bread, one for each of the 12 tribes. They sat there for a whole week, reminding anybody who went into that space that God provides, even in hard times. And then after that bread had been on display for a week, they would pull it off and put new, fresh bread up in its place. And rather than throw that bread out or see it go to waste, it went to the priests. That's how it ends up at Ahimelech's house. What David is asking Ahimelech to do is to give him the bread that is a crime against the king to give. To give him the bread that is a crime against God to give. But what Ahimelech seems to know in this moment is that God chooses to be merciful. God chooses to provide. God chooses to meet ordinary human need. And so the bread of the presence ended up doing exactly what it was supposed to do. It became more than just a symbol. It became actual bread that fed actual people and made an actual difference in people's lives. For centuries, people who have been motivated by their faith have gone out to show that same kind of mercy to the people around them. And as they do, it's a kind of witness. It's a kind of testimony to who God calls us to be and who God is. Normally, when we talk about evangelism, the picture that we get in our head is of some angry preacher standing on the street corner, waving a Bible, telling you how angry God is with you and how you better get your life together. But sometimes evangelism looks like being merciful when there's no reason to. It looks like showing God's love and mercy and grace. It looks like sharing bread or Honey Nut Cheerios or apple and brown sugar oatmeal. Now, all of this whole charade would probably be just a quirky little story in the Old Testament, except that Jesus calls it to memory later on in the Gospels. Jesus and his disciples are traveling and they are hungry, and his disciples reach out and grab some grain off the stalk to eat. But the thing is, that's a little bit too much like harvesting for the Pharisees. And harvesting is a prohibited act on the Sabbath. It's not something you do. And so they challenge Jesus and say, why are the people you teach, why are your disciples breaking the Sabbath? And Jesus says, if you knew what it meant to desire mercy and not sacrifice, you wouldn't even ask me a question like that. God says, I desire mercy and not a sacrifice. You see, for followers of Jesus, the question is not so much what is legal, but what is moral, what is ethical. What does God's love look like in this situation? What does God's love look like when people are hungry? What does God's love look like in this elementary school? What does God's love look like in this boardroom or this legislative chamber or among these flesh and blood people that God has brought into your life exactly for a time like this? the question is not, what does the law say? But what does God's love call me to here in this time and this place? Friends, what we have seen over and over again in this series is that sometimes what is legal and what is ethical or moral does not always line up. It was against the law for the midwives to lie to Pharaoh and say, oh, well, we just couldn't get there in time. It was against the law for Rahab to shield those spies. It was against the law for Esther to go unbidden in front of the king and plead for the lives of her people. It was against the law for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to refuse to bend the knee. And yet, every single time, God was with them in that. God used their faithfulness to further life and mercy and hope. And each and every time that happens, it's a little bit like a tree root that grows underneath the concrete. It may be hidden for a while. You might look and think that nothing is happening, but sooner or later, all of those small acts of growth, all of those acts of hope, love, mercy, peace, grace, they strengthen the root, and it starts to do things like break the concrete, lift up what was supposed to be set down forever. Friends, I don't know about you, but we can look out on the world and see all sorts of things that seem immovable. Like they have been laid down and will never be changed, never be moved, never be shaken. But here's the thing. Since the very foundation of the world, God has been animating people of faith to acts of love and mercy and justice that strengthen that root so much that it can break concrete. So much so that it can shape not just our world here in this place, but the world that we go back out into for the other 167 days in a week. Friends, you have been loved by Jesus with an everlasting love, equipped for this world right now, for times like these, to show acts of love and mercy and grace. And as you do, you are connected not just to David and Ahimelech, not to Jesus and his disciples, but to all of the saints of every time and place who use ordinary love, ordinary mercy, ordinary hands and feet to shape this world that God loves.